With Russia now having lost more than 4,000 tanks in Ukraine, and a few tank storage bases we've been closely monitoring for years finally becoming completely empty, I wondered if there's any other source of tanks Russia could access. Maybe any other countries that might be able to send Russia tanks to make up for their losses. There's not many countries with large arsenals of tanks that are on great terms with Russia, and a few of them that are playing a delicate balancing act in international relations. There are a couple though, one with over 1,000 tanks left over from the Soviet Union, and not a huge need for them. But first, our sponsor, Exter. Imagine you're rushing to pay, digging through a bulky, disorganized wallet, cards slipping out maybe. Frustration is building. If that sounds familiar, then it's time for a change. Meet the Exter Wallet Pro, the ultimate solution for your everyday carry. It's crafted with premium Valencia leather and a fully recyclable aluminum mechanism. It holds up to 14 cards and bills, yet its slim design slides effortlessly into your pocket. No more bulky lumps ruining your style. Their new redesigned, upgraded enclosure keeps everything secure, so you'll never lose a thing. But here's the real game changer, that Finder card. Just slip this in your Wallet Pro, or honestly into any wallet, and if it ever goes missing, just track it down with your smartphone, working seamlessly with Apple's Find My app. Their support says a single charge will last up to 6 months, but they sent me this back in December. I haven't charged it a single time, so over 9 months now, and it still has battery life. Also, all their products are backed by a lifetime warranty, so if you're ready for an upgrade, head over to Exter.com and grab yourself a Wallet Pro or even the Finder card today. Right now, they're currently running their summer primetime sale with up to 32% off, but on top of that, my viewers get an extra 10% off in addition. So experience the future of wallets with Exter. The first thing to ask is, does Russia even need tanks? Our counts of tanks at storage bases show every one has declined drastically, with a few now virtually completely empty. The 1295th, for example, with not a single visible tank in the whole facility. The only ones that remain are a few demilitarized monuments put on display here. The 22nd is another that's rapidly approaching zero, and will likely be there before the end of the year. So, will Russia actually run out of tanks? The answer to that is really complex, and if you ever see somebody claiming definitively one way or the other, they're either lying or they don't understand what they're talking about. I know this is something we've seen people talk about that's been pretty frustrating, especially to people like Jompy and HIMARS who have spent just hundreds and hundreds of hours researching, counting, and tracking these vehicles for years now. On one hand, technically, they'll never completely run out of tanks. As their numbers dwindle, they'll have to use them more sparingly. Plus, since they're still building new ones, although nowhere near the rate to make up for losses, they will never have zero. There will always be a few somewhere. More generally though, they could effectively run out of tanks. This is when they cannot keep up replacing losses and the numbers drop eventually to the point where tanks are no longer a major factor in the war. Russia had roughly 6,000 tanks in storage before the war began, and in the 3.5 years since, they've removed over 4,000 of them. And this is where it gets complicated. Of the some 2,000 remaining in storage, really 0 are in great condition. The ones in great shape were taken out first and sent to Ukraine. As those ran out, they gradually started removing tanks in worse and worse condition, which required more and more work to get operational. So those remaining today are virtually all really bad. But with enough work and money, most can and may will be restored and made operational. It's really more of a question of how desperate they are, as well as the supply of spare parts available. But as it becomes more and more costly to do so, Russia could look for alternative ways to replenish the tank reserves, like getting them from other countries, just as Ukraine has heavily relied on other countries for tanks and other vehicles. There are very few countries in the world that have huge tank arsenals, and even fewer of them have a huge surplus they could afford to sell. That's even further reduced if you remove countries that are not friendly with Russia, like NATO countries. Starting outside former Soviet states, there are really just 3: China, Iran, and North Korea. All 3 have provided military hardware to Russia to some degree or another in the war in Ukraine. North Korea may be the most likely, but its tank reserves are extremely old, and even those they'd likely prefer to keep for themselves in the event of a war. North Korea has sent Russia plenty of artillery rounds, and even some artillery pieces, but those are much more easily replaced than tanks. With Iran, it's a similar situation. While the threat of a land invasion is low, Iran would likely prefer to hold on to whatever tanks they have as a deterrent. On top of that, a big number of their tanks are old British and American ones left over from before the revolution, so they wouldn't be of much use to Russia. China possesses a vast majority of tanks and could theoretically supply Russia, but this is unlikely as China seeks to maintain a delicate balance, portraying itself as a neutral party in the conflict to avoid damaging its international reputation as a global power. So that leaves just post-Soviet states. Of these, a few are now part of NATO, others not on good terms with Russia, including obviously Ukraine, and some have their own border disputes and tensions. Really, the only 2 countries that fit that criteria, and with any decent number of tanks, are Belarus and Kazakhstan. Each country held what was once a Soviet armored storage base during the Cold War. In Belarus, what is now called the 969th, and in Kazakhstan, the Otar Reserve Armor Storage Depot. Belarus might be considered the most likely, given their close ties with Russia and that they did allow Russia to use their country as a staging point to invade Ukraine in 2022. The 969th is difficult to count, especially since the war began and they built several covered shelters, likely to try to conceal vehicle numbers due to its proximity to Ukraine in case Ukraine tried to attack it. Before the new shelters went up, there were about 350 visible tanks. Unfortunately, there's little available recent satellite imagery, again likely due to it being so close to Ukraine, less than 100 miles, or about 150 kilometers away. What you'll see on Google is from 2019. I was able to get an image of the base in October 2022, and then the most recent today I could get was from March 2024. In this image, there are just over 80 visible in a fenced area on the west side of the base, all T-72 variants. If we assume the rest are still there and just covered, as well as maybe some others additionally in garages, there's likely some 400 to 500 tanks total stored here. However, being that Belarus borders several NATO nations, it might be less likely that they'd be willing to give very many of them to Russia, but it is possible. Kazakhstan is the other. The Otar base is massive. Again, it was historically a Soviet storage depot and has been used often by Russia over the years during military exercises. It's a real tricky one to count given just how spread out it is. Numerous shelters, facilities, training grounds, and more. In the main storage area, I counted about 740 tanks, and another 100 in the larger facility, but appear to be in operational service. So there's still a huge number that they could potentially give Russia. However, since the war, tensions have grown between Kazakhstan and Russia. A 2025 poll found that 41% of Kazakhs expressed fear of a Russian attack. And over the years, the country has become more neutral, wishing to strike a balance between the West, Russia, and China. So it's also kind of questionable whether they'd be willing to overtly support Russia by selling or giving them tanks. But again, it's very possible. So in summary, there are a few options that Russia could pursue to bolster its tank force, that, according to Oryx, has suffered over 4,000 losses so far in the war. However, they all have their problems. Russia still is not in dire need yet, and the situation isn't desperate, but we'll have to wait and see whether current peace talks will yield an end to the war before that happens, or if Russia will decide to continue shifting to using less and less armor in the war.